Well, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar on land value capture. I'm Tony Crook from the University of Sheffield, and I'm also a member of the RTPI board. And I'm joined by 5 research and practice colleagues, plus Sarah Richardson from RTPI, who's going to moderate our question and answer session. Each of us has long experience of land value capture in research and practice, both in the UK and overseas. This is always a challenging as well as a topical issue. Planners, you might say, have become tax gatherers. I've got the outline of the session on the screen now, which I hope you can see. I'm going to start by reminding us all of the objectives in land value capture and some of the key outcomes from the latest research. And then Christine, John and Tom are going to pick up some specific themes, as you can see there, and that'll be followed by Stefano and Nick, looking at lessons and practice in Scotland, and particularly lessons from Denmark and perhaps from the rest of Europe. We've all disciplined ourselves to speak for 5 minutes max, so that we've got adequate time for a Q&A, and do use the chat function to send Sarah your questions. All the slides are going to be available for everyone who's on the call. My apologies to my colleagues that we couldn't get rid of the University of Sheffield logo or display everybody else's. So let's start, and I'm hoping I can make this platform work properly. So, first point, what are we trying to do with land value capture, and what's the key research findings? So, as you'll see on the screen there have been 3 objectives in seeking to capture land value: improve economic efficiency, improve equity, and raise income for public spending. What we've done from the planning perspective is focus largely on capturing development value that results from planning permission, not capturing land value increases which rise from greater prosperity or new infrastructure investment, motorways, airports, other public transport. The policy mechanisms since 1947 have been threefold. We've had 3 attempts at unhypothecated national taxation: 1947, 1966 and 1974. We've also done it through public acquisition of land at its existing use value, such as in the early new towns, where subsequent development enabled the new town corporations to capture the increased value that generated. But much more recently, we've done it through planning obligations and SIL. We've done it because landowners get less for the land by and large through these approaches. The research we're going to talk about covers a lot of what we've done, but particularly covers the last 5-6 studies of planning obligations in England, which we've done for the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. And the latest one we had hoped would be published by now, but sadly not yet. So moving on, a couple of slides on the research outcomes. A little bit busy, but hopefully useful. On the left-hand box, we've got the value captured. In the blue one, it's the nominal values, and in the red one, it's in real terms, expressed in 2007-8 prices. And you'll notice on the far left of that first box, very small bars. And these were the sums generated by the unhypothecated national taxation. And it's taken from 3 of the years of each of the initiatives. But the other boxes show the very considerable sums raised through planning obligations and latterly through SIL, rising up to £6 billion in 2016-17, over half of which was for affordable housing. And these are sums both in cash and in kind. And on the right-hand side box, you can see what that's been worth per new home developed. Obligations largely deal with residential, but we've looked at the value captured on each site on average, and you can see that in the recent study it comes up to about £40,000 per home. And right at the bottom, I've made a note that very little land was captured during the periods land was captured in the 3 periods of national taxation. My final slide summarizes what we see to be the advantages and disadvantages of planning obligations. So we've seen that significant funds have been raised, and planning obligations have delivered a large amount of affordable homes, at least half in the most recent estimate. we've worked out that it's probably capturing about 30% of the development value on greenfield sites with planning consent. And of course, the state captures other aspects of it through national taxation. We've seen that these negotiated contributions do work better than a fixed rate national tax, but it does need clear and simple policy in adopted local plans. And the recent High Court judgment in Parkhurst shows how absolutely important that can be. And contributions are local, so people living locally on development become the beneficiaries. They're contractual and they can be enforced. But it works best in tight markets, which generate the values to be captured. But, and here are the downsides, negotiations are long drawn out, complex, and as John will say later on, viability is still a challenge. And there are big variations between local planning authorities in very similar market contexts, and that's a factor to do with local discretion and local attitudes. But many, many developments make no contributions at all despite SIL, partly because of the exemptions under SIL and the small site exemptions under planning obligations. But, and I know this is something we'll come back to, only development value is being captured. Much of the investment we're making creates more value, but we're not capturing it. And now I'm going to hand over to Christine. Hello, Christine.
Hello, my microphone is on. I hope it can be heard.
Yes, I can hear you, Christine. Go for it.
Yeah. We're still on your slide. Can we move on to the next slide? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, got it.
His estimate is around 40 to 50% of land value increases are captured in these three ways: the local way, plus transactions, and capital gains. But certainly at the political level, there are many who argue that that is totally optimistic and the amounts captured are very, very much less than that. And I have heard, not unusually, people working from a very different angle and saying, look, affordable housing is 80% of market value, social housing is whatever. And if you look at affordable housing in general being 30% and often mostly affordable, then it can be seen to be account for, if you're really mean, 6% of market value. If you're generous, 10% of market value. Now, clearly the evidence which Tony was suggesting suggests that it's significantly more than that. It's defined in different terms. The important thing is that much of the political debate doesn't take account of the other uses to which Section 106 and SIL are put, other than affordable housing. They take very little account of the differences in costs and no account, usually, of the transfer prices of affordable homes. In other words, well, what the housing association actually pays for it, and therefore how it works through into land values. What we do know is that whatever we do and however well we do it, we can't expect to capture anything like 100% of land values or land value increases, because the housing market in Britain is extremely volatile. So, you know, if you're a developer who bought a land at the beginning of the year, you're looking at a very, very different market now. And there's also the whole risk around the process of planning permissions. And now, of course, at least with respect to Section 106, there is the problem of permitted developments, which is going to be extended, and that will exclude the collection of Section 106, and in some cases, that of SIL. Tony, can you, next one, please?
Should have it, Christine.
Next one, please.
Yes.
Next one, please.
You've got it.
No. No, I haven't got it.
Well, it's on my screen.
I've still got the same one. Oh, well, I've got a problem, and I'm going to have to make it up.
It might just be a small way, Christine.
No, I've now lost it completely. Sorry. what slide that I can't see says is that the whole problem, or a big problem about this, is that we are only looking at developer contributions. And therefore, I'm going to take my glasses off because I can now see it down here. Most of the benefits of land value increases, particularly those from infrastructure and prosperity, which are often very large indeed, go to existing owners of the land and are not directly taxed. Now, in the context of businesses, they are taxed because business rates do, to some extent, reflect that land value increase. But when you look at residential, there is absolutely no relationship, or almost no relationship, between the increase in the value of the property and the increase in the value of the land and how much people pay. The result of this is that we have a very flat system, a very regressive system of council tax, but most importantly, one which raises very little money as compared to the increases in values which have taken place. So yes, it is the case that there's potential in the Section 106 SIL context. Equally, it is the case that there would be a hell of a lot more to be gained and would be distributionally very much more desirable if, instead of just taxing developer contributions, we taxed land values across the board. Thank you.
And now over to John. Hopefully you can see that on your screen, John. Hello, John. Sarah, have we lost John?
John, are you there? I think John's just on mute. I'll unmute him.
Oh,
John, are you there?
can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think you were just muted.
Okay.
John, you've got your first slide on the screen. I have anyway.
Yeah, I have two, thank you. And this
Excellent.
is an extract from the latest government guidance on viability. And it highlights the wicked problem that we're often faced with, which is how to achieve the most effective balance between risk-adjusted returns to developers and landowners on the one hand, and public benefits arising from the application of planning policy related to development on the other. To have the next slide. The viability guidance identifies in these bullet points, which are all direct quotes, the inherent tension between the two aims, especially at the margins of viability. Because if you see the bottom 2 points, if the total costs of planning policies are such as to threaten viability, then policies should be revised to ensure that they are realistic and deliverable. And I think the unspoken subtext here is that in these circumstances, policy requirements, or at least their cost, need to be reduced to maintain viability, which is a difficult decision for planners to make. You have the next slide, please.
Should be up, John.
Yeah, that's right. If we consider the implications of increasing the cost of planning policy requirements for viability, the left-hand column is a starting point with substantial returns to the developer and the landowner available once all the costs, including policy costs, are subtracted from the gross development value of the scheme. If we move to the middle column, we see that extra policy demands, which are highlighted in the text there, of 10 nominal units are imposed. That would increase costs by 15.4%, but would reduce the land development value by 1/3. So that means that the increase in costs of 15% has reduced the returns by 1/3. So the gearing is over 2. There's twice as much impact on the return as was change in the policy. This sort of gearing effect is exaggerated in lower value areas, which are shown on the right, with the same cost structure, but because the GDV is lower, the impact on the returns to the landowner in this case is even greater. 10% reduction in value reduces the land development value by 50%. If we did the same calculation as the middle one, we actually get 15% increase in costs and a 50% reduction in land development value. So that has an impact 3 times as great. And this is a real problem for us. If we go to the next slide, because it exacerbates the issue of trying to balance viability with policy returns. The wider use of land value capture through planning obligations and SIL. For example, they're proposing to add on biodiversity net gain costs and the costs of zero carbon policies to planning obligations. Now, adding those costs will yet again increase overall development costs and exacerbate the problem of balancing policy requirements with viability. Gearing increases the impact of these costs. Consequently, a larger proportionate reductions in land value as a result. More proposed developments will then require a trade-off to be made between policy return and financial return, and the regressive effects of using cost-based instruments to capture land value in lower value areas will become more marked.
Thanks, John. I'm moving on now to bring in Tom Dodson. Tom, what developers think about all this?
Okay,
you've got your first slide. You've got your first slide up, John. Tom?
I've got my first slide up, and first of all, I have to admit that I'm not actually a developer, but an advisor, and work with lots of developers, both public, private sector, registered providers, and others. I think what I'm going to do is talk briefly about how developers look at land, which is kind of very different from the theoretical perspective that we've talked about in some ways, and then how the debate, the land value capture debate, and options. So firstly, looking at the developer's perspective, there is no single perspective. We have lots of different interests and lots of different people who operate in different ways. So obviously landowners themselves are trying to maximise the price that they receive for their land. You've got the kind of strategic land players and traders who are seeking to maximise the difference between the price they've paid for the land and what they sell it to developers for. You've then got kind of long-term interests like commercial developers and asset managers who are looking to get returns both from development but also from the appreciation in values over time. And then house builders who will have very different models for different types of site, which I'll kind of return to. But I think fundamentally none of them look at it as a theory, and I'll kind of illustrate that with a bit of an anecdote from when I was in my first job in local government. Went into it full of planning theory and sitting in one of the early negotiations on affordable housing on a big London site with a director of housing and one of London's big developers, who was still one of London's big developers, and neither of them were shrinking violence. But the conversation went something like this. The housing director says, we want 25% affordable housing on site. The developer says, okay, in that case, I'm going to take my money elsewhere. And then the housing director says, well, fair enough, but you can't take the site elsewhere. And there's a lot more swearing than that involved, but you'll get the kind of general gist. And then ultimately the developer did their sums and came back and gave the 25% affordable housing. And I think despite years of refinement of the art and science of viability assessments, the basic proposition remains the same. Can the developer make the obligations work and deliver a profitable development? And that ties back into some of the theory that John has just talked about. I mean, in relation to Section 106 and SIL obligations, developers are always wanting to minimise them and have a focus on the idea that Section 106 should be about mitigation and policy rather than as a taxation mechanism. And SIL should be low and simple, as in the Mayor of London's approach, and not kind of complex and trying to push the margins, partly because of the diversity of sites, which I think both Christine and John have referred to. And there are two other really important factors. Christine's touched on this one as well, which is that some of the more simplistic or maybe optimistic discussions about the amount of land value there is to be captured ignore risk and time as key considerations for how a developer looks at things. So they take a before and after land value and say, here's the difference which we could have captured, but at the same time, the huge risks in development cycles and other things make it not that simple. And in some ways, the public sector may be, particularly on big sites, better equipped to take those risks and rewards itself. And I think Nick's presentation around Denmark will pick up some of those. But it's also fair to say that if you look at local authorities and others who are building their own housing, I think they find that delivering the 50% affordable housing alongside the obligations is actually not as easy as some of their planning colleagues might think, even with land put in at nil value. So there's a level of realism about what you can get out of things. And then lastly, on the kind of future models, sorry, Tony, next slide, please. Yeah. The future models, I think we should be cautious of the kind of magic bullet solutions that are going to solve at one fell swoop all of the problems of the planning system, and that applies to this area as much as it does to zoning or other things. And I think focusing on practical solutions for different types of site is probably a good way forward. So on standard kind of housing, greenfield sites with similar characteristics, using what Philip Barnes from Barrett and Richard Harwood QC have described as right pricing of land, which is getting the obligations right and fixed into land prices. Large strategic developments, we've been very good at planning but not building, often for viability reasons. And I think the public sector leadership is absolutely critical on that, and partnership with others. And then lastly, for kind of urban sites with the complexity of different sites, I think there's the opportunity to do a couple of things. One is the low, broad taxation generally, and the other is then focused on those sites which are beneficiaries from infrastructure. So what the Mayor of London has done on Crossrail and TfL have been looking at in terms of their research. So that's my kind of general background and perspective. Look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Tom, thanks. And now over to Stefano, because there are some interesting changes in Scotland coming up, Stefano. Hope you can see your first slide. Stefano, are you there? Sarah, is Stefano on?
Yeah, I've been unmuted. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much, Chair. Over the next 5 minutes, I'll update you on the various approaches to capturing land value through the planning system in Scotland. I'll consider three main areas. Firstly, the overriding principle of the infrastructure first approach in funding and delivering infrastructure in Scotland. Secondly, a brief canter through the current approach to capturing land value, namely Section 75 obligations, which is equivalent to Section 106s in England and Wales. And finally, I'll outline some of the alternative and emerging approaches to land value capture, namely the infrastructure levy and master plan consent areas. Firstly, however, no, can you go back to the previous slide? Sorry, Tony. Thank you. Firstly, however, to provide some context, in addition to the currently ongoing implementation of the Planning Scotland Act 2019, Scottish Government are taking forward a number of other strands of work under the wider planning reforms, including land value capture uplift. Scottish Government remain very interested in the concept of capturing land value uplift and using that to fund infrastructure. Following the report by the Scottish Land Commission published in May 2019, Options for Land Value Uplift Capture, Advice to Scottish Ministers, Scottish Government is exploring how land value capture can be more effectively captured for public benefit. This will include taking stock of the effectiveness of existing mechanisms such as planning obligations before exploring new approaches such as the infrastructure levy. Scottish Government intend to bring forward a package of proposals that addresses how authorities can effectively assemble land, tackle problem properties and capture land value uplifts ready for the next administration to consider. They don't expect to legislate on these issues in this Parliament, but are currently engaging with local authorities, Scottish Land Commission, Scottish Futures Trust, and industry representatives to properly explore all options to make sure they get it right. Next slide, please. Thanks, Tony. Infrastructure is key to Scotland's economic prosperity, driving inclusive growth. The key principle underpinning enabling infrastructure and the thread which runs through infrastructure delivery is the infrastructure first approach, building upon the independent review of the planning system recommendation. The flow diagram in this slide captures the infrastructure first approach and what it seeks to achieve. The approach identifies that infrastructure delivery sits across the national, strategic or regional and local levels, and these all impact on the shape and development of place. Integral to the infrastructure first approach is building certainty around funding and recognizing the distinction between infrastructure delivery needed to offset the cumulative impact of new development with that of a more strategic scale which promotes wider growth and regeneration agendas. An infrastructure first approach means identifying and addressing the infrastructure capacity and requirements arising from development, including their impacts and needs at a local, strategic and national basis. Next slide, please. Thanks, Tony. Planning obligations under Section 75 of the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1997 can be used to seek contributions towards or in kind provision of the infrastructure required to mitigate the impact of proposed developments in order to make them acceptable in planning terms. Although capturing land value is not the explicit purpose of planning obligations, by securing mitigation necessary to make specific development acceptable, this can nevertheless be an outcome or effect of their use. Scottish Government policy on planning obligations is set out in Planning Circular 3/2012, including the tests governing their use. Section 75 planning obligations are currently the principal planning mechanism for capturing increases in land value in Scotland. Land value uplift is also captured, albeit on an unhypothecated basis, through fiscal mechanisms such as capital gains tax, land and buildings transactions tax, etc. It should also be noted that in circumstances, contributions may be sought through alternative legal mechanisms, for example, agreements under Section 69, Local Government Scotland Act 1973, the Roads Scotland Act 1984, and the Sewage Scotland Act 1968. And planning conditions are also sometimes used for similar purposes. A review of the current planning system in Scotland has identified significant scope to improve the effectiveness of Section 75 agreements and move away from protracted negotiated-based outcomes. At the core of these recommendations is an emphasis on building more cost and time certainty into future interventions to enable improved market responsiveness, whilst looking to how local authorities can help upskill and resource teams to administer and engage Section 75 agreements in a more efficient manner. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, just go back to that previous slide, please, Tony. Thank you. Scottish Government is about to commence research on the value, incidence and impact of developer contributions in Scotland. As part of Scottish Government's commitment to reviewing the effectiveness of current mechanisms, this research will help to provide evidence on the effectiveness of current land value capture mechanisms, focusing in particular on how much they currently raise in Scotland, what the funds are being spent on, and what this represents as a proportion of development value. Next slide, please, Tony.
Okay, and fairly briefly, Stefano, if you would.
Yep. Although developer contributions play an important role in the delivery of local infrastructure, their ability to contribute to the delivery of strategic infrastructure is currently limited. The new infrastructure levy included within the current Planning Scotland Act, Part 5, Sections 54 to 58 and Schedule 1 has been developed to address this issue. The infrastructure levy seeks to capture contributions to strategic infrastructure through a charge triggered when planning consent is granted that would be applied to most development types. It is intended to operate alongside Section 75 obligations, reflecting the different circumstances where each can be applied. Next slide, please, Tony. Thanks. Master plan consent areas are in the Planning Scotland Act 2019 Part 2, sections 15 to 16 and Schedule 2. MCAs will be a useful proactive tool to promote and incentivise investment in development, including new housing, by providing consent in advance for specified types of development in carefully defined circumstances in a particular area. In effect, they will grant upfront consents for planned development, so adding certainty and removing much of the risk for potential investors. A number of pilots are underway using the existing simplified planning zone mechanism, for example, Montgomery Park in North Ayrshire, to explore how this approach can be used in a variety of contexts, ranging from town centres living to supporting rural communities. Scottish Government will wait until those pilots are completed to draw on their experience and design the regulations setting out detailed procedures for master plan consent areas. This concludes my brief canter through land value capture in Scotland, and I look forward to responding to any questions you may have at the end of these presentations. I'd like to now hand you over to Nicholas Falk, who will provide a European insight to land value capture with a particular focus on Denmark. Thanks, Nicholas.
Thanks, Stefano. Over to Nicholas. Hopefully, Nicholas, you're being unmuted.
Yeah, Nicholas, you're unmuted.
Sarah, have we got a problem?
I think it's Nicholas's mic. I think we'll just have to move on. I'm not sure what the issue is.
Okay, can you keep him unmuted and then try and get him back for the question and answers? Colleagues, sorry about this. Oh, he's here. Nick, are you there?
Yes.
Fire away, Nick. We've got a few minutes. Keep going.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm using a different laptop from the one I tested out before. It's quite hard to talk about the whole of Europe when the systems are different, fundamentally different, I would say, in general from that of Britain. But as a generalization, one can say that the European or Northern European countries have managed to keep housing much more affordable and to build both more and better. And particularly there are similarities between countries like Germany, Austria and Denmark. And I'm just going to focus on one example, Denmark, which is about the same size as Scotland and which once had very real economic problems. In the 80s, unemployment was 17.5%. So the fact that we look at places like Copenhagen, now ranked as one of the best cities in the world, and say how wonderful it is, it wasn't always that way. And the key has been proactive planning and land assembly. In other words, instead of waiting for developers to come up with ideas and sites, the local authorities have driven development forward. And that means that you have a spatial planning system which identifies where land can be developed, and that means that the land is identified next to transport infrastructure. So you get, if you like, transit-oriented development. And that's particularly obvious in the case of the city of Copenhagen, famous for its finger plan, and where Sixth Finger has now been developed with a new town, Ørestad, on it. And the impressive thing about Ørestad, which is just 8 minutes from the city centre and about 5 minutes from the airport, is that it's a complete new town. It provides many jobs, the university students and so on, but it's funded the building of the new metro line to the airport. So the whole trick has been to fund infrastructure through taking over land close to existing use value, in this case, land from the military. And this works in Denmark generally because public land is pooled. So instead of each public agency focusing on its own land, the land is brought together in a single body. And in the case of the city of Copenhagen, the company is now called City and Port. This is a joint company with the government, but the municipality has the majority of the shares in it. So once you start off with the land, of course, you're then in a good position to borrow money at low rates of interest and put in the infrastructure. And once you put in the infrastructure, you can then begin to sell off service sites, sites with not only roads and utilities, but also with a brief as to what can be put on the site, which takes a lot of the risk out of development, and it helps to explain why in general on the continent development is very much faster than it is in the States, than in the UK. Interestingly, you pay property taxes in Denmark once land has been rezoned, so there's a great incentive if you are a private landowner to get on with it, because you're otherwise going to have to pay a higher tax. One of the significant things about Denmark, which does make it different from other European countries, is they apply land value capture not just to the uplift of development land when it's developed for the first time, but also they apply it to all existing property owners. So you pay two types of tax. You pay a property tax based on the land and a tax based on the value of the building. And the land tax, which is the majority tax, goes to the government and then is reapportioned. So there is a concern for fairness generally. And since 1924, the land tax has been based on the thousandths of the value. I've tried to work out how much, it's true that generally people pay higher taxes in Denmark and of course have much higher services, particularly childcare. But it would seem from comparison I made that you'd probably be paying 3 times as much as you would in Britain through council tax. So yes, the taxes are higher, though income tax is a much higher tax than land tax. A Danish colleague points out, however, that the system is much simpler. Instead of having masses of different taxes, which are very complicated to understand, taxes are bundled together. I want to now take you to one town, the second city of Denmark, Aarhus, which is about 3 hours. Yeah.
Nick, fairly quickly, because we're running out of time. Yeah.
Okay. It's 3 hours by train. The city took over the land from the port, North Harbour, and has built this splendid looking place. These buildings are known as icebergs. It's of course like other places in Denmark, cycling is now very popular, but they've also financed a new tram. Now, Aarhus has a population of 330,000, but it employs 20,000 staff in the municipality, which is, say, 3 times the amount of Bristol. So there's no doubt the system is very different. But the proof of the pudding is that the people are happy, children are much happier than in the UK, and the housing is so much more affordable that people can afford to go skiing and have good holidays. So I do think it's worth people at least making a visit to Denmark once we can go abroad again and seeing for themselves the places I've just mentioned.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Thank you very much, all colleagues, and I hope those who are watching and listening have found that useful. Sarah, I'm now going to bring you in for some questions and we'll try to answer. Sarah, should I kill the presentation so you can get us all on the screen? Sarah?
Yeah, I think everybody's on the screens. Christine's there, isn't she? Everybody who's on the screen, that should be on the screen's on the screen. So everyone can see that. But yeah, we've got about 6 minutes, so we can take some questions.
Yes, I'm not on the screen, but I can hear you, Sarah, don't worry.
So, so we've had 2 similar questions from Adam Murray and Vincent Goodstart, both to ask about whether reform is needed, and if so, how the panelists would change the system for capturing land value to balance commercial viability and maximising the public interest.
Well, I'll ask Christine to have a first go at that. John Henry is not on the screen, but he may want to come in. Christine.
I suppose the first thing is that whenever you change something in Britain, it means that everything slows down for a very long time. So although I can see the benefits of very large changes and very structural changes, I suspect that we will do better in the next few years if we try to maintain and improve the situation that we've got at the present time. That is not to say it's the best. I just think that the evidence is that sudden, sharp changes in the planning system, which is fundamentally an interface between the law and policy, really run into problems, and the lawyers make most of the money for the first 5 years.
Tom, your understanding of the developer's perspective, you kind of hinted at what they might like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with Christine's basic principle that it's probably about improving all of the different parts of the system that are there rather than introducing comprehensive new changes. I think there may need to be some focus changes in relation to, say, CPO around the bigger new town strategic development type projects, and also potentially integration of the various different recurrent income streams on business rates and council tax, which in itself needs reforming, which could build the funding packages for new infrastructure in the way that Nick described. But I wouldn't throw everything up in the air. The other caution, obviously, is that SIL, for example, hasn't been through a recession yet. So we will see what happens over the next period in a potentially falling market.
And I think that means a different approach in different places. So in areas of large comprehensive development, we might start to think about what Scotland are doing and what is happening in Aarhus, for example. Sarah, you'll have another question. We're anxious to do as many as we can.
Yeah, so we've got a question from Clive Brook regarding Tom Dobson's identification of the main players in development. Do we also need to distinguish between the large and small house builders since they have different approaches, he's asked?
Well, I think my quick answer to that, and others may want to come in, is that the system is complicated, and it's inevitably become complicated. And John's made the point about all the additional requirements now being, put on Section 106. Larger developers, I think Tom would agree, have a capacity to do this. SME builders, it's much more difficult, and they don't have the resources to put the money up front. So some of the elements of simplicity people are talking about for small sites should work better for them. Tom or John, do you want to come in on that quickly? Or Christine does first. I can see her. Christine, you first then.
Tom first.
Tom.
I'll be very quick. I think, yes, we do need to reflect the different house builder models and the different types. And the point I made about risk and time is one of the big ones. So if people are getting quickly in and out, they're generally not relying too much on land value uplift. If people are doing longer term developments, then there may be more opportunity for long-term approaches to securing that uplift.
Christine.
I think my concern, I hate the oligopolistic structure of the UK system, but the problem of how you change it is not by producing lots and lots of tiny builders. But most importantly, I think post-COVID, we're going to have, and pre-climate change, we're going to have to use an enormous number of people for improving the existing stock. And that is where smaller builders do extremely well. And I would much rather that we didn't try to do something which we can't do and made it possible for builders, yes, of course, through some sort of planning, pre-planning, come into it. But I don't think the answer is going to be lots and lots of small builders building lots and lots of houses.
Let's try and get a couple of more questions in because time is precious. Sarah, fire away.
Yeah, we've had a question from Bernard Donnelly, and Bernard's asked, developer lobbying at the political level can overturn Section 106/community infrastructure levy proposals. Do the panel feel that this should be addressed, and if so, how?
Tom, I think you might want to comment on that. Sorry to keep bringing you in, but you've got more insights than we have.
Yeah, other than obviously the recent example of lobbying around SIL contributions, usually SIL is actually very difficult for anyone to lobby and change, and the fixed nature and value of SIL has been, I think, quite effective in the fact that those things can't happen.
Let's try one more question, Sarah, because I know you're going to cut us off almost imminently.
Yeah, we're running out of time, I'm afraid. We've got another question from Clive Brook. He's asked, in France, they use landscaping control zones to work out total community costs on a neighbourhood plan type basis. Would this work in the UK?
Well, I'm going to ask Stefano and Nick to do that quickly. Stefano, master plan consent areas are going to work on those sorts of principles, aren't they?
I think Stefano might be muted. Stefano,
Perfect.
can you hear us?
You're absolutely right, Tony. Master plan areas, which are in the Planning Scotland Act, work on that principle, where a defined area removes or provides upfront planning consent, which in theory should accelerate the process, reduce risk, facilitate development quickly.
And Nick, that's how those larger public-private partnerships work in Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, don't they?
There is no alternative, in my view, on these large sites, particularly in growth zones where you need to build quickly for either a development corporation or a joint venture, but which has local authority leadership built into it, to put in the infrastructure, which would include landscaping up front to create the confidence needed for many small builders. And I was checking that in Eurostat, the average size of development is about 120 units. And that's not so different from the Netherlands. We, I think, give over far too much power, expect too much from a few very large house builders who do effectively have a monopoly. And we don't give a fair chance to the many smaller organizations, which would include housing associations. One further point, 40% of housing in Copenhagen is co-housing. So there's a whole sector, if you like, cooperative sector, which we've forgotten about in the UK, but which would again help a much wider range of people to live happily than is possible under the present system in the UK.
And happens under the German pooling system. I do. John Hennery, is there anything you want to add to these questions? Because we're about to time expire. Hi, John. I think we've lost John, Sarah. We got time for one more question, Sarah.
Yeah, we can do another question. So this one's from Paul Umfreville. Paul's asked, given the government's aim to speed up the development process, i.e. to perpetuate the narrative that planning process is the problem, do the panelists think that the direction of travel is away from capturing land value?
Well, can I say that as we are going to have to pay for infrastructure somehow, and there's a general resistance to either business taxes or income tax, then in my view, land value is the obvious place to go in order to pay for local infrastructure, which would include a proportion of social housing. So to my mind, it's not either or. You've got to change the planning system, but you've then got to use the land value in areas where there is positive land value, and that's only a small proportion of the country, to actually help pay for the improvements in the local infrastructure that everyone, not just the new residents, will benefit from.
Yes, just a quick comment for me. I think we've had the experience of permitted development in the conversion of offices into residential. I mean, some of it's been good, but most of it's not been very good at all. But the big problem is that because it's permitted development, you get no Section 106 contributions. So you don't get contributions to schools, et cetera, So if we're going to speed up the planning process and still want to capture land value, we've got to create a structure which does both. Stefano, I can see you wanting to come in.
Just one very quick point from a Scottish perspective. Using planning policies to capture uplifts in land value is most effective, obviously, in areas of relatively high market demand, where development value is high and scope for large uplifts. Now, development values in much of Scotland are not very high. So exclusively market-based approach is unlikely to be efficient, which implies a more proactive approach by the state may be required to achieving Scotland's placemaking ambitions.
And I think one of the lessons from all the work we've done, both in practice and research, is the horses for courses point that Tom's made. You actually got to think about the different size of sites and the different players. before we can actually bring something like this off. And I think the Scottish approach that's being explored has some interesting stuff for us in England, and I think also Denmark. Sarah, we've got time for one more question, or are you now about to wipe us off, as it were?
We'll let you go over. We'll have one more. So Matthew Driver has asked, to what extent do you believe land that is currently within the green belt could be taxed twice to justify its release for development?
Oh, I'm going to ask John Hennery to come in on that one.
Sorry,
John.
That land in the green belt should be
taxed twice.
Taxed twice. I'm not sure that complies with the good taxation principles, actually. I think there is definitely a major issue around the effect that the green belt has on land values within it and on commuting patterns beyond it. And I know it's a sacred cow, but I would certainly support some critical assessment of the role that the green belt is playing and the implications it has for land values, particularly in the south. I can see Christine's also.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think, Barbara and Christine, it raises the general issue that Christine's raised, which is through what we're talking about, we're capturing the increase in value after planning permission. What about, I live in a national park. I think I should pay capital gains tax if I sell my house. Christine. Sarah, can you unmute Christine?
The issue about capital gains tax is a major problem, and I was interested because we've been looking at it across countries. There's only one country that is now actually operating a capital gains tax for primary homes, which does suggest that it's politically uncomfortable. And the one that's doing it is actually giving an enormous amount to the rich in the way that they actually operate it. I think in the context of Green Belt, I'm really interested in what the government is going to say in its policy paper as opposed to white paper, because if it's not going to go down some relaxation or adjustment of Green Belt, then I don't think that many of the other things which it's going to do are going to be terribly exciting either.
Yes. Sarah, have we come to the end of our time, or do you want to squeeze one more in?
I think we're at the end now, I'm afraid.
Okay. So
yeah.
I just want, thanks, Sarah. I just want to finish by saying two things. First of all, I hope that those of you who've attended, if that's the right word, have found this useful and informative. There will be slides made available and it's been recorded. But equally importantly, thank my colleagues who I can see on the screen, Stefano, Tom, Nick, Christine and John, who I know is there, but we can't see. Thank them very much for taking part in this. And as they say, we'll meet again somewhere soon, I hope. So thank you very much. And Sarah, you will now dismiss us all, as it were. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. See some of you next Friday.
Indeed.